I'm going to call upon Jennifer Caplan to make her way to the bima over on this side. So, Chevre, we're going to take our machzorim for a moment and we're going to close them. We're not going to need them for the next few minutes. So, according to our tradition, at this time, we are supposed to listen and read the section of prayers and remembrance, really history, called Ela Eskara. Ela Eskara basically means these are those who I remember. Jennifer, let's invite you on this side over here when you're ready. And it's a tradition on Yom Kippur, the theology, the idea of the rabbis was that on Yom Kippur, the greatest, holiest day of the year, which we are begging and asking for atonement and forgiveness, we say, God, if you will listen to our prayers, please hear us. We are trying. We are doing our absolute best. But if for some reason the gates of prayer are closed to us, for some reason God's, so to speak, not listening or not open to them, then let's bring another reason why God should listen better, closer, and really open up those gates as wide as possible. And the reason the rabbis gave us was because of all those Jews throughout our history who very sadly suffered and were killed as martyrs simply for being Jews. And in that text, which is in our Machzor, and you can read it certainly during the break, it talks about various times in Jewish history, but primarily focusing on the time of the Talmud, during the Hadrianic persecutions when we were not allowed to be public Jews or study Torah, do brisses, honor Shabbat, and we were killed. Literally, our great rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, great rabbis were killed, tortured, persecuted, just because they were Jews, just because an evil power said we could not be who we are. What we have decided, and I take this from my teachers at my former shul, B'nai Jeshurun in Manhattan, have decided is that we don't need to look back to 2,000 years ago, sadly, or 1,000 years ago, or even 100 years ago, to find times where Jews were persecuted and killed just because they were Jews. Very sadly, in our tradition, most recently, so to speak, we have the Shoah, we have the Holocaust. And we consider it, on this day, a kind of prayer to God, to say, God, listen to these stories. And to this congregation, listen to these stories. Because we know, sadly, that as the years go on, more and more of our survivors are leaving this world. And their story needs to be preserved for God, for the world, and for us. And so we're very fortunate each year to bring someone forward who has a story either directly related to them or to a member of their family. In this case, we are so honored to have Jennifer come speak, Jennifer Caplan, to come speak about her own grandfather, who thank God is still living but was unable to make it here to our shul today. So she's speaking on his behalf and telling his story, a unique story in certain ways because it deals with the Jewish community of Salonika, Greece, which in the Ashkenazi world in particular has gotten less focus by and large. So I invite us to open up our hearts and souls to hearing Jennifer's story, her grandfather's story, her grandparents' story, and to really seeing that as an opportunity for a prayer to honor the memory of all those who suffered and died. So Jennifer, I'm asking you to speak over here. It's okay.
I wish everyone here could just step into my grandfather's apartment in Delray Beach for a minute, because you would know right away that the person who lives there has some stories to tell. Not only is his pantry always overflowing with food, but he put an extra set of shelves up in the kitchen, and he probably has enough food stashed there to last for months. He has trouble throwing things away, like plastic bags from the grocery store. And every time I go there, he has 4 saved messages on his answering machine, the last one from each of his grandchildren, because he's always worried that something will happen to one of us. I never knew growing up what had happened to my grandparents personally. I knew they were Holocaust survivors, but they never talked about it. And all this changed about 8 years ago when my grandmother passed away. All of a sudden, my grandfather, Shimon, started to talk. And when I sit in this apartment and look around and listen to his stories, it seems like these are things that are so close. We think of the Holocaust as something so far in the past, but that's just not how it feels at all when I sit there and listen to him. My grandfather Shimon was born in Salonika, Greece in 1918, and he was the youngest by far of four, born to an Orthodox family. His oldest sister was 14 when he was born. Her name was Sunny, and she was really like a second mother to him growing up. He also had two older brothers. And he lived in the Jewish ghetto of Salonika, which had about 60,000 people at the time. And the interesting thing about Salonika at this time was that it had really just become part of Greece shortly before he was born. So he became the first person in his family to go to school outside of the ghetto with non-Jewish Greeks and learn the Greek language. Most other people in the ghetto just spoke Ladino. Also, from a very young age, he started working at his father's shoe factory, making orthopedic shoes and boots. When he was 13 years old and he graduated from school, like most boys his age, that was the end of his education for now. He ended up going to work in his father's factory part-time with the hope that one day he would be able to go to medical school to become an orthopedist. But he missed his education so much that he remembered how quickly he'd picked up Greek, and he started teaching himself languages as he grew up. By the time he entered the Army for the military service in 1939, he spoke 14 languages, including German, English, Polish, Yiddish, Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, Turkish, Swedish, and a couple more. So when he entered the Army at age 21, like I said, it was 1939. And the first thing that happened was he was assigned to a captain whose father happened to be one of his father's good customers. And the captain went up to him right away and said, "Shimon, you have to fight as hard as you can when the war comes to Greece because Hitler is killing all the Jews." And Shimon said, "First of all, why would the war even come to Greece? It has nothing to do with us. We should be safe here. And secondly, why would anyone kill people for no reason?" He just didn't believe it at all. But the following year, in October of 1940, late one night, an Italian foreign minister knocked on the Greek president's door and asked for permission to occupy the country. The president said no and shut the door, and that was the beginning of the war in Greece. Shimon went to fighting the Italians with very poor provisions. The Greek army had very little food, very little supplies. There were days when he said he had nothing to eat except for what he called pebble soup, which was basically they would just take a handful of grass and a couple of pebbles and throw it in water and call that their soup. But despite this, the Greeks ended up pushing the Italians all the way back into Albania, essentially defeating them until the Germans came in and intervened. By this time, Shimon's captain had been killed, and he had risen to the highest rank in the army that a Jew could hold, which was lieutenant colonel. So when it came time to surrender to the Germans, it was him that had to personally surrender. He remembered what the captain had said about the Jews, and he gave his captain's name instead of his own, just to be on the safe side. From there, he and his men walked 200 miles from Albania back to Greece, covered in lice and feet bleeding with blisters. When he stepped back into Greece, he saw right away how much it had changed. The Greek flags had been taken down and there were Nazi flags flying, and Germans were patrolling the streets everywhere. He raced home to check on his family and found that they were still doing okay. By this point, his siblings were married. His brothers each had 2 kids, and his sister Sunny was expecting her 5th. And like many of the soldiers who got home from the war, he decided right away to get married. He ended up marrying within weeks to the daughter of a family friend named Martha, and he enrolled in medical school as he'd always hoped to do. 10 months later, they had a son named Yaakov, and shortly after Yaakov was born, he showed up to medical school to find a sign that said, "No classes for Jews." He went to his professor, but he told him there's nothing we can do. So he went back to work in his father's factory, hoping that that was the worst thing that was going to happen. But one blazing hot July day, the Germans undertook their first major action against the Jews of Salonika. They called all the young men, ages 18 to 45, to a place called Freedom Square, and Shimon went with about 9,000 other men to this square. And when they got there, they had them lined up so tightly, their shoulders were touching each other, and Shimon remembers his nose was almost touching the back of the head of the man in front of him. And they were told to take their hats off, and anyone who could who wiped the sweat off their brow or who tried to shield their eyes from the sun would be beaten. Shimon at least had the advantage of being able to understand what the Germans said. Many people didn't know and were beaten right away for not listening. They stood there for hours in the blazing hot sun with nothing to eat or drink. And then all of a sudden the Germans decided to do something else. They started pulling out small groups of men, between 3 and 7 men. And Shimon remembers being pulled out, and they told him, put your arms out straight in front of you and squat up and down until somebody falls. So he started doing that, squatting up and down over and over again. And then he heard something, and he looked up on the balcony and could see that there were people there, and they were dressed like in suits and in evening gowns, and they were clapping and laughing and taking pictures. And so he continued the squatting until the man next to him fell. And when he did, the man was beaten and doused with water and then forced to get back up in line. They stayed there for the rest of the day. And when they were finally told they could leave, they started walking slowly, not only because they were exhausted, but they were afraid to move too quickly. And then the Germans started chasing them, and Shimon remembers running all the way home. He went home to his wife and son and hoped, again, this would be the last thing that would happen. But they were called back again to the square. He figured for another day of the same kind of exercises, but instead they were registering for work detail, and all of a sudden he was on a transport to Macedonia. The Greeks wanted people to use dynamite to blow up the mountains so they could build their roads for easier access. Now, people on this work detail began dying very quickly, not only from the dynamite, but malaria was spreading and there was very little food. Shimon told me that he would get every day a bowl of soggy eggplant, sometimes with a crust of bread and a few sips of water, and that was it. The months went by, and he continued with this work. And then all of a sudden, everyone was told they were going home. He had no idea what had happened. He ran home to find his wife and his son still safe, and then they went to see his father, who explained that the Jews of Salonika had collected all the money they had, pretty much every dollar, and some from Athens too, and traded it for the men. And then the Germans said that wasn't enough. So what they did was claim the Jewish cemetery, which dated back almost 500 years. They dug it up and raided the tombs and used the tombstones for building materials. After that, the Jewish community was told they were going to be resettled into one of 3 ghettos before they would finally be moved to Poland. Shimon and his family were told to pack up everything they owned and move into a place called the Baron Hirsch Ghetto. And when they got there, it was sealed behind them with brick and barbed wire. The first thing they did was fill out a form saying each person of the head of the family, who was in their family and their ages and any valuables that they had left, and hand this in. And then they were assigned to live 4 people to a room. And there was very little food in the ghetto, as you can imagine. Actually, there was very little food in Greece anywhere because the shipping and the whole economy had been interrupted. And so at that point, Shimon remembers one of the last things he did in the ghetto was celebrate Purim with his family. And then one night they went to sleep, and at 2 o'clock in the morning they heard Germans shouting from the streets outside. They said, "Come downstairs, there's a train waiting to take you to Poland." He got downstairs and saw that there were 40 open train cars waiting, and people were pushing in one direction or another. Men were being separated from the women and children, and he quickly lost hold of Martha and Yaakov, and also his sister Sunny, who was busy trying to keep her 5 children together. He ended up on a train that was so tightly packed he could barely move, but then the Germans said, "Why did you stop moving? More people can fit in there." And so by the time the train doors were closed, nobody could even lift their arms. They stayed there through the rest of the night and the following day, and he started to wonder if maybe somehow the doors would open and they would be let back out in Greece. Finally, the German soldiers came around with a crust of bread and a few sips of water. They continued waiting another night and another day without moving. Finally, the train cars started to move, and after a total of 8 days on the train, they arrived, and they were told that they were in Poland. When the train doors opened, people fell out dead. They couldn't fall before because there was no room. And so he stepped out of the cars and looked around, and it seemed like the women and children and most people were all forming this one line, going off in one direction, kind of being shuffled off. And then there was another German guard who was shouting, "Anyone who can work, come with me." Well, of course, the problem with these Greek Jews was that they couldn't understand German because they didn't speak Yiddish. And so the Germans figured, if you can't understand me, you can't be of any use to me. Shimon did understand what he was saying, and he followed the man to work. He thought that he was making a sacrifice, while the rest of his family was maybe being relocated to some kind of new ghetto or some kind of barracks. And so he went off. And as he was walking, he looked around and realized he wasn't in any kind of labor camp because there was barbed wire and there were towers with armed guards. And then he saw the sign, "Work sets you free." And he realized that he was in prison. He was in Auschwitz, as you probably all have guessed by now. And so when he arrived at his new barracks, the other Jewish prisoners at first wouldn't even talk to him because they thought he looked too differently than they did. He had really dark skin and black wavy hair, and they figured, this man doesn't speak our language, he's not going to last, we better not get to know him. And then he surprised them by speaking every language they spoke and more. And one of the other first things he did was go up to the Romanian capo and make sure that they were friends. He spoke Romanian to him and offered to shine his boots every day. On his third night in Auschwitz, Shimon started to see smoke and smell what he thought was barbecue. He thought, the nerve of those Nazis to be cooking something when we're all starving up here, because that's what it smelled like. And he started asking people, what are those Nazis cooking up there while we're starving? And people just shushed him and ran away. They didn't want to even talk to him after that. And he kept asking over and over. He couldn't get an answer, and he didn't understand why. And then he finally went up to the capo and said, what are those Nazis cooking up there while we're starving? And the capo said, Shimon, they're cooking your wife and your child, your parents and your siblings and their children. And this is how he learned the true nature of Auschwitz. But he thought to himself, I haven't seen this with my own eyes. Maybe there's some way that they survived. Maybe, I didn't see it. Maybe they're waiting somewhere, and if I survive, then I can help them. So he determined he would do anything he could to survive. So he went to work doing the same hard labor that most other people were doing. But then someone approached a group of the prisoners and said, we need some volunteers for the Sonderkommando. You will get to sleep in more comfortable beds made of straw, and you'll get double rations. Well, he looked around, and nobody was volunteering, and he didn't understand why. He translated the word Sonderkommando, but it just meant special unit, so that didn't help him at all. But he figured it seemed like an opportunity he couldn't pass up, so he volunteered. And so right after that, the Romanian capo came up to him and said, you just volunteered to work in the gas chambers. And he couldn't believe what he had done. And then the capo also told him, the Sonderkommando is a death sentence, because after 3 months, the first thing they do is put the old unit in the gas chambers, because they don't want any of them to survive to tell their stories, because these are the people who have really seen too much. And not only that, but some people don't even make it 3 months because they go into the gas chambers too quickly and die from smelling the gas. So Shimon thought, at most, I have 3 months to figure out how I'm going to get out of this. His first job in the Sonderkommando was called the Canada Commando. And what they did was basically wait for new arrivals. People who were destined for the gas chambers, of course, didn't know it. And they would just walk past them and basically take their belongings. They were not allowed to speak at all. There were German guards there with guns, and anyone who opened their mouth or answered any questions would be shot immediately, and so would the person they were speaking to. And so they would take these belongings and bring them to a warehouse where they were sorted. Sometimes someone in the Sonderkommando would even see a member of his own family in this line. So Shimon remembers one day when he first started, he quickly discovered that a lot of these people brought food in their suitcases. And what the Canada Commando would do was look through their belongings and pull out the food and hide it in their jackets. They somehow all rigged their jackets with some kind of wire so they could hold more food in them. And then they would meet later and share it. Well, after Shimon took a suitcase from a Hungarian, he brought it to the Canada Commando warehouse and opened it, and he could smell right away that there was a salami somewhere inside that suitcase. So he found it in a brown paper package and tucked it in his jacket and called his friend, "Come and meet me in the bathroom. We're going to share this." And so that's what they did. And so when he got there, he opened the package and he started, using his fingernails to break the salami in half. And all of a sudden, when he broke it, something came pouring out from the inside and landed all over the floor. And he looked down, and the floor was covered with diamonds. And so, well, of course, the salami was of more interest to them than the diamonds. So first they finished eating, and then he looked down at the floor and collected all the diamonds and thought, there must be something I can do with these here. Clearly they're of value to someone, if not me. His friend wanted nothing to do with it and just walked away. But what he did is just tuck them in his pocket and go up to this one officer who was always checking on them and trying to catch them sneaking food away. And he said, "I saw something. I thought you should see it right away." And once the officer looked at it, he said, "You did the right thing coming to me. Make sure in the future, if you ever see anything like this, bring it straight to me, and I'll make sure no one bothers you in the warehouse. You can take whatever food you want." So he continued there for a few more weeks. But then he was switched to work in the actual gas chamber. He remembers the guards telling people to get undressed, that they were going to have a shower. Whole families and all different people from all over the world lining up. And after the doors would close, the Sonder Commando would go wait outside. But he said no matter how far they went, he could hear the screaming from inside when the gas was turned on. And when the doors finally opened, he remembered what the capo said, and he waited about 2 hours before going inside. And when he got in there, he saw people that were bleeding from their eyes and ears, and babies that had turned blue, and pregnant women with blood coming from their belly buttons. And they had to carry them all out. And then after they carried them out, they cut their hair and put it in a box to be sent to Germany because hair catches fire so quickly. They were told the Germans used it to make their bombs. And then they broke open jaws of people with fillings and removed the metal fillings and sorted them into different cans depending on what kind of metal they were. He continued working in the gas chambers for a few weeks like this, and this is when he started developing some severe stomach problems, as you can imagine. After that, someone one day said, "Come help me at the crematorium. We're going to load these bodies up and bring them over there." And so, when someone asks you to do something, the only answer is yes, obviously. So he did that, and when they got to the crematorium, he was told to go around the side of the building and open these valves. He didn't really know what was going on at this point, but when the bodies were burning, there was some kind of like an oil coming out, and he was supposed to fill these drums and then cover it and put new drums. And once they were done, once the truck had been emptied, they loaded these drums of oil onto the truck and said, "We have to do one other thing." And they were driving to this building he'd never seen before, and he was trying to figure out what was going on. And when he got into this building and unloaded these drums, he saw inside there were boxes of soap. And they all said RIF on them, which meant pure Jewish fat when translated. And that's what they were doing with this oil. He said the soaps were about 1/2 inch thick and maybe like 2 by 4 inches, very small, boxes and boxes of them. And the man that was working there was a Russian. And Shimon had picked up Russian in the last few months, and so started talking to him and trying to figure out what was going on and everything. And then the Russian said he'd been looking for someone to help him with the soaps. And he was hoping that person would speak Russian. And he asked Shimon if he would stay there. And he, of course, didn't want to stay there. But he said, "Let's put it this way. You can stay here or you can go back to the gas chamber." So he chose to stay there, moving the drums back and forth and packing them up. And then, ever since he left the Canada Commando, he no longer had that access to that extra food, so he was really starving again by this point. It turns out that double rations of watery soup is not that much better than single rations. So what he started doing was swiping some of the soaps. He would take 4 of them and put one like in each side of his sock, because they only patted him down, like from the hips up. They never checked down there. And then the camp nearby was these Polish, non-Jewish political prisoners, and these were people that had families still back at home, and they were sending them packages of food. Now, one thing they didn't have, he heard, was soap. So he went over there, and he pulled someone aside and said, "Can I trade you for some bread?" And the man said yes, and he would bring some friends. In a few days, can you bring more soaps? So that's what he did. And when he got back there, the man said, "I like the soap very much, but it's very grainy, and I was wondering why that is." And now Shimon just thought quickly and said, "We put sand in there because we get tar in our hands. We get really dirty doing hard labor, and we need a way to get it off." He couldn't tell him the truth was that it was the ashes from the burned body in the soap. At this point, it had been almost 3 months that had passed, and Shimon thought, I have to find a way to get out of here quickly, because he knew the new unit was going to be coming in very soon. And so one day, when an officer came up to them and asked, "Is anyone here an electrical engineer?" he raised his hand right away without even thinking. Well, of course, you know by now that he had no knowledge whatsoever of electrical engineering. But he figured this was a chance he had to take. And so right away, he ran to see that same Romanian capo and told him what he had done. And he said, "You have to find a way to get me out of here before they figure out what I've done." And he said, "There's a transport of workers leaving for Buna right now." And Shimon said, "What is this place, Buna?" Not many people have heard of it, I think, but it's called Auschwitz III. Actually, it's like another subcamp of Auschwitz. And there's like a rubber factory there and pretty much hard labor. And Shimon said, "I'll take it. Show me where the truck is." He didn't even care what was there, of course. So he hopped on the back of this truck, and off he went. And when he got off the truck in Buna, no one knew that he was supposed to be an electrical engineer or that he had been in the Sonder Commando. And from what I've read, it seems like somewhere between maybe 12 and 30 people total survived serving in the Sonder Commando. That's how careful they were about not letting them go. When he got to Buna, though, he realized he had a whole other set of problems. The workers that had been there for a while, they had all become what they called muscle men, which was basically like skin and bones, like a walking skeleton. And what they did in Buna was just bring in new workers and then bring out the old ones to be gassed. And when he got there and started doing the hard labor and drinking the watery soup again, he was growing thinner and thinner. And then Passover came, and the Germans thought, they announced all of a sudden that they were having a special meal for Passover. And after a long day of hard labor, the people came in to get, their soup or whatever the Germans were giving them, and they were so hungry and so thirsty. And what they were serving was really, really salty, dry herring. And so when the people got it, they just started choking it down as quickly as they could. And then a lot of them actually started choking. And Shimon remembers running to the water faucets to try to get a drink, but the Germans had shut off all the water. So people started choking. They started trying to bite other people. And the ones that survived, like Shimon, were the ones that thought to drink their own urine. It was after this that he realized that he just didn't see how he was going to survive this place. He needed to find some way to get out of this. He had no idea what he was going to do. But then there was a high-ranking German officer walking through camp one day, an Obstinführer, and he was limping when he walked and wincing when he put his foot down. And Shimon just dropped what he was doing and walked right up to him. And the man started reaching for his gun right away, so he just started talking quickly. He said, "I can make you a pair of boots that will take that pain away." Because remember, he had spent all those years in the shoe factory. And the officer said, if you don't now, then I'm going to kill you." And Shimon said, "I know." And so the capo arranged for a time for them to meet. and he took a cast of his foot and got an old pair of boots and got all the supplies he needed. The only thing he didn't get, actually, was a piece of wood he needed for the heel. So what he did was pull down a plank of wood from the bathroom that he used and used that. And a week later, he met the officer with the shoes. And the officer took one look at them and said, "If these boots fit me anything like I think they're going to, then you've saved your life." And Shimon remembers when he put them on, he described that they fit like silk stockings, like a second skin. And the man started walking around, and he was still wincing for a minute, and then all of a sudden there was like a pop, and you could see something had shifted and his pain was gone. He looked at Shimon and he said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Shimon." He said, "I'm going to call you Sam." And then he gave him a ration card that basically said he could go to the back of the Nazis' kitchen and eat there. And when he first went there to eat, I mean, there were 5 guns aimed at him within seconds, and he held up the card and everyone put their weapons down and let him pass. He didn't know how long this was going to last or what was going to happen, but a few days later, another officer walked up to him and said, "Are you Sam? I need you to make me some boots." And so after that, he went to work in the Nazi hospital. He became the boot maker and shoemaker to the Nazis for about 5 months. Not only that, but sometimes some of the officers would bring in their wives, and they would bring like pictures of the latest fashions and have Shimon copy them, like high-heeled shoes or whatever they wanted, basically. And he spent this 5 months working, learning to make boots so perfectly because he knew nothing less would be tolerated. And he was building up his strength again, which was good, because on January 18th, 1945, that's when all the Auschwitz camps started the death march into Germany. He started out much stronger than most, and when he started walking, there were tens of thousands of people. And then as he was walking, the lines grew thinner and thinner, and the gunshots grew closer and closer. He said for 3 days and nights, he had nothing but snow to eat, and sometimes he was walking with his eyes closed, like he didn't even know how his feet were moving anymore. One time, even though the German guards were switched out regularly, one time one of them grew tired and asked Shimon to help carry him while he walked. After the 3 days and nights, they were loaded onto train cars. And he was thankful at least not to be walking anymore, but he realized that on a train car, you don't have access to the snow, and that was the only thing they had to sustain them. So he thought about what to do, and then all of a sudden he took the shoe off one of the men in the car who had died and asked everyone for their shoelaces, and he tied them together. And what he did was anytime the train slowed or stopped, he would throw the shoe overboard and like drag it in the snow and pull up some snow in it, and that's what they ate for the rest of the trip. He took the train all the way to Buchenwald and worked there for about 2.5 months, doing hard labor at night, and then rode one last train to Bergen-Belsen in April of 1945. A week later, Bergen-Belsen was liberated. The first thing he did after going into the hospital and building his strength back up was starting to check the registries to find his family. He went from one town to another trying to check, but not only did he not find anyone from his family, he couldn't even find a single person from Greece. And then he heard that in Hamburg there was a centralized registry at a Jewish community house that had been donated by the mayor of that town. And he said, "That's what I need, is a bigger town with a bigger registry." So he traveled there, and when he showed up at this house and checked the registry, there was still nobody on it. And later on, he was able to confirm that his whole family had died in the gas chamber shortly after arriving from Greece, that day that he had smelled the smoke and thought it was barbecue. And so he finally did find 3 people from Greece that showed up at this house. One of them happened to be his best friend from when he was a little boy, and they actually were neighbors in Delray Beach until recently. And he just felt like he had to keep himself busy, so he started becoming a translator for the United States Army. He rode around in jeeps all day. He got an American Army uniform he was very proud of, and he sometimes even ended up translating when they were questioning captured Nazis. But even though his mind was as sharp as ever, his body was not ready for this kind of work, and his stomach problems acted up again. He ended up going back into the hospital. But it was in the hospital that he met a Polish woman named Sarah, who had survived years in the Lodz ghetto and a death march from Stutthof, and she had lost her husband as well. A month after being released from the hospital, Shimon and Sarah were married. They tried to set up their home in Hamburg, but they never felt at home. They couldn't imagine how that could be their home. And then Shimon got 2 letters from Greece. The first one said, "According to our records, you own 4 houses here, yours, your 2 brothers, and your father's." But even with the promise of those houses, he couldn't imagine going back there with his family and his community gone. The second letter from Greece said, "According to our records, you still have 6 months left on your mandatory army service. Please come back and finish it." So at that point he figured, I think it's time to leave Europe. And he ended up coming to America, where an uncle who had left before the war was actually the foreman of a garment district factory, and Shimon and Sarah went to work in this factory and became the fastest workers that anyone had ever seen there. They actually would tease Sarah and say that she was working on those dresses like her life depended on it. And what they didn't know was that she'd spent years in the ghetto stitching Nazi uniforms 14 to 16 hours a day. After my father, Jeffrey, was born in 1952, Shimon decided, I have to make a better life for my family. We can't work like this in this factory anymore now. And when they moved into a new apartment, it just so happened that his new landlady walked with a limp. And so you can imagine, long story short, he ended up opening his own shoe factory one day on Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn. And he worked morning till night, 6 days a week. He didn't understand the concept of the American weekend ever. And he continued like this for years until Sarah grew weaker and weaker from Parkinson's disease. And when that happened, he started taking care of her and refusing any help. He bathed her, changed her. He even cut her hair and colored it the color she liked. And he never would take any help. When she finally passed away on his 85th birthday, she had been homebound for 15 years. I thought, foolishly, that he might feel some degree of relief, not only that her pain and suffering was over, but I couldn't imagine at his age or at any age how he would keep working like that. But all he kept saying was, I would have worked twice as hard to keep her alive. And I'm telling you this story about my grandmother because it made me think about everything that he'd been through in his life and how he got through it all. I just couldn't understand. I had to ask him one day, how did you keep going when you thought you had lost everything? And he said there was a time in Buna when he really felt like he didn't know if he could make it anymore after that Passover incident with the herring. And actually, I didn't know how bad things got for him in Buna until I saw my grandfather this past weekend in Florida, and he rolled up his pants leg and showed me this scar that was about this big. And he said one of the Nazis stuck him with a bayonet one day just while he was working. And after that, he just wrapped a tourniquet around it and had to go back to work. And this was right before he started making the boots. So what happened is he went to get his soup that day, and he looked in it, and there was grass and a pebble floating in it. And he thought, I can't believe after all these years I'm eating this pebble soup again. And he sat down and realized how dangerous that kind of thinking was, that just self-defeating thought. And so all of a sudden he started smiling and humming to himself while he was eating this soup. And then everyone around him started looking around and thinking, Shimon is finally cracked up, he's over the edge, you know. And then they started actually getting a little annoyed. They were like, what are you so happy about? We're starving here. And he said, well, I'm eating steak. And they were like, you know, either he's gone crazy. One of them just checked in his bowl just to make sure, like, he didn't get anything good. And it was the same watery soup they all said. And he said, if I think I'm eating steak, then I'm eating steak. And as some of you know, I've been working on a book about my family for the last about 2.5 years, just everything my grandparents had been through and the effects on later generations of our family. And it's because of this that I called the book Eating Pebble Soup. I want to thank everyone so much for listening to this story today, and thanks so much to Rabbi Solomon for inviting me.